Hello, and good afternoon, good morning, good evening, wherever you are joining us from. Welcome to the BS Group webinar on shipping emissions regulations. Where are we today and where is the industry heading? For those who don't know me, I'm Rachel Hoyland. I'm a lawyer at international law firm Stephenson Harwood. Specifically, I'm quite a rare breed of lawyer. I'm a maritime decarbonisation lawyer. What does that mean? It means that I work with clients through the maritime ecosystem, be they owners, charterers, financiers, manufacturers, fuel producers and suppliers, anyone in that ecosystem, to help them navigate the legal aspects of maritime decarbonisation. So that means that I'm in the privileged position today of being asked to lead on the questions to a fantastic panel of others who are working very deeply in the maritime decarbonisation space. I have the pleasure of knowing each of the panelists individually, so I'm able to say hand on heart that they have deep expertise in this field, that they have a passion for the topic, and they have a really valuable perspective that I think you'll be very interested to hear from them today. So that you, the audience, can get to know them as well, I'll ask them in a moment to give a quick introduction to their organisation and their role. But I want to remind you before we do that although I'm leading the questions, I'm not the only person who can ask the questions. So you are invited to add yours as we go in the chat, and we will try and keep an eye on those and answer them as we go. And we'll have a bit of a Q&A session at the end as well. So over to the panel, let's meet them. Can I come first to you, Dan, to make an introduction to your organisation and your role, although I know your current role is very new.
Yeah, thanks for having me, BS Group, and Rachel for the introduction. It's nice to be here. So yeah, my name is Daniel Gent. I am responsible for the marine fuels transition in the Soya Group. A bit about the Soya Group: it's a family-owned shipping company, but more than that, actually, it's it's an organization with multiple interests across the shipping, real estate, agriculture space. It is the owner of Wallenius Lines, which is a part owner of United European Car Carriers, which is where I joined the group from. It's always been a pioneer in introducing new technologies, alternative fuels, and innovation, going back to the development of car carriers themselves back in the 60s and 70s. And my role here is really about it's kind of at the intersection of fuel supply, regulatory exposure, and commercial structuring. And what I mean by that is my background is in fuel procurement. I have focused very heavily for the last decade on introducing alternative fuels and alternative technologies to an operational fleet of vessels across Europe. And latterly, I've been working really hard on developing the commercialization of alternative fuels, meaning creating a product that can be sold through Scope 3 marketplaces, or creating regulatory products that can be sold through, for example, FuelEU Maritime.
Fantastic, Dan. I look forward to asking more questions around that, and I'm sure there'll be plenty coming from the audience as well. Andreas, could I come to you next?
Absolutely, and thank you for the introduction, and thank you to the BS Group as well for organizing this one. My name is Andreas. I'm a market risk analyst at owner-operator DS Norden, where I've also been working or functioning as the resident expert on the FuelEU Maritime regulation for the past couple of years. So DS Norden is one of the larger companies in the dry and wet bulk space. And as I mentioned, we are an owner-operator, which means that we are situated at the very center of all of this decarbonization journey, and especially in terms of the regulations, where we act in both capacity and as owner and operators, and therefore also get a lot of the different experiences in this stage. We have around 500 vessels out on the sea at any given point in time, and with more than 155 years of experience, I'm pretty certain that we're also ready to brave the storm of decarbonization. And actually, in many ways, to DS Norden, the storm of decarbonization is not something new. We've been on a biofuel journey for the last many years and have pioneered biofuel usage in the here and now in order to reduce our scope emissions. So we want to see ourselves as a green shipping company. We want to push that brand and products to our cargo customers. And that's also why why I'm here today, is because how we can do that in a large organization, both in terms of the regulatory aspects, for instance, FuelEU Maritime, as well as the more voluntary markets that Stan was also mentioning earlier on. So yeah, look very much forward to this conversation.
Brilliant, fantastic. Thank you so much, Andreas. 500 vessels, that's an enormous fleet, so a lot of opportunity to gain experience from all of those vessels on the water. Gabriela, can I come to you? Would you like to introduce yourself to the audience?
Yes, thank you. Hi, everyone, and thank you, Rachel, for inviting me to join this panel today. Very excited. My name is Gabriela Sanchez. I'm a managing counsel at Peninsula based in London, so my background is slightly different. I work in the legal team. In my role, I advise across Peninsula's global marine fuel supply, trading, and decarbonisation activities, with a particular focus on the fast-evolving world of the maritime emissions regulations. I lead our legal response to frameworks such as the EU ETS, FuelEU Maritime, RED, and the emerging IMO Net Zero framework, helping our commercial teams interpret the regulatory requirements and embed them into our day-to-day operations. I also serve as a co-chair of Peninsula's Compliance Committee, where I work with cross-functional teams to ensure that we have a strong governance in place and are ready for the pace and complexity of the incoming regulation. I am closely involved in the development of our alternative fuels and the new business initiatives, from bio-LNG and ammonia bunkering to FuelEU pooling, voluntary insetting, and next-generation low-carbon products offerings. Ultimately, my role is about helping Peninsula anticipate change, navigate risk, and build credible pathways towards lower carbon marine energy, which in turn enables us to better support our customers worldwide as they progress on their own decarbonisation journeys. And just for those who may not be familiar with Peninsula, Peninsula is a leading global marine energy supplier with an ambitious sustainability and decarbonisation agenda. A core pillar of Peninsula's strategy is the rapid expansion of alternative fuel solutions. Since launching LNG in 2020 and biofuels in 2023, Peninsula has been scaling alternative fuels availability across global locations, operating its own LNG bunkering vessel and increasing biofuel within its own fleet. And the company is also actively developing the supply of next-generation low-carbon fuels, including bio-LNG, methanol, and ammonia, and has advanced projects such as the design of an ammonia bunkering vessel and a new methanol and biofuel supply vessel. So delighted to be here today and share our perspective as a marine fuel supplier.
Fantastic. Thank you, Gabriela. And that's such an important piece of the puzzle. I think as we get into this discussion, we'll really explore how the fuel element and the fuel transition aspect is so crucial as we move through these different eras of maritime decarbonisation. We've been having a bit of a dialogue internally at Stephenson Harwood recently amongst the maritime decarbonisation team, and we're reflecting on maritime decarb being different in 2026 to what it was in 2025, to what it was in 2024, and to what it looked like in the eras before that, before it was really the heavily regulated area that it's come to be, even though at the moment there are still many gaps in regulation. Dan, I was pleased that you used the word pioneer in your introduction, because you're someone who I see as one of the pioneers exploring decarbonisation possibilities before energy transition for shipping was mandated at all. And we've had this proliferation of emissions regulations, EEXI, CII, EU ETS, FuelEU, UK ETS coming into force this year, other national emissions trading schemes, possibly IMO, NZF in the future. I think you're in a good position to have quite a long perspective on this. So what's your take on the way in which the concept of sustainability in maritime has evolved in that time over these changing eras?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting, because I think I've seen the full evolution really from, kind of the pre-decarbonisation era as it was. I mean, if you remember, we had desulfurization before we had decarbonisation, and we had very specific legislation which was targeted in certain regions around the world, starting in Europe, to limit sulfur content of fuels. That wasn't a shift to reduce carbon. It was a very specific issue to try to remove sulfur from fuels in certain sensitive geographic areas. if the way I look at sort of the evolution of sustainability is, it broadly can be split into sort of 3 eras. I would say you have, let's call it the reputational era. So if I think back to when we introduced the first LNG car carriers in UECC, those vessels were ordered at a time that those vessels were trading into Russia. The decision really was run on high sulfur fuel oil with a scrubber, or run on LNG dual fuel. That was the kind of fuel choice at that time. And to many, the logical thing to do would have been to choose to run on high sulfur fuel oil, because the scrubber cost would have been paid back very, very quickly, and then thereafter you live with that vessel until you see what future regulation comes. But the ownership took a different view, that actually running LNG dual fuel vessels would make a lot more sense, not only to future proof, but also to kind of bolster the reputation of the company as a sort of forward thinker. And I think that let's call it the reputational era. This was at a time at which shipping companies would make investments in alternative fuels or in alternative technology, and do so on the basis that they build a platform of credibility. They build a platform of knowledge, of understanding, but specifically credibility with customers who understand that this is a company trying to do something better. We then sort of entered what I would call the efficiency era. So this is when we get EEXI and we have CII and these kind of regulations coming in. These are technical regulatory measures to try to optimize vessels, often on a vessel specific basis. You know, this kind of efficiency era is about trying to make ships more efficient in general overall. And then you get into where we are now, which is, I would almost call it the financialization era, or the commercialization era. This is where now you have an exposure on the balance sheet. You have EU ETS, real hard financial penalties towards using certain fuels. FuelEU Maritime, clearly very significant penalties to non-compliance. And the interesting thing here is you can't operate your way out of these regulations. These regulations are designed specifically to target a change in fuels. So that's a sort of general evolution of sustainability as I've seen it. And the key shifts that I would say I've seen are, you've gone very much from ship level thinking to fleet level optimization. FuelEU Maritime is a great example of that. Even if your individual vessel is not compliant, you're looking across the fleet holistically and seeing how you can balance them out. You're going from technical compliance to a more of a portfolio strategy. You know, it used to be the case that the ship management departments and shipping companies dealt with EEXI and CII. They start to become, you know, these regulations become a more commercial, and they move more into the business part of the company rather than the ship management. And I think the key point here, I suppose for me, is that sustainability shouldn't be seen as a peripheral thing anymore. It now is deeply embedded in the commercial and risk functions of a company, and it should be seen that way.
That's fantastic. I love how you break that out there. I would love to see a Taylor Swift tour around the different eras, especially the era of efficiency.
I wouldn't, but that's personal preference.
That's a perspective that really resonates for me as well. I wonder, and we'll come on to it later, whether what we will see hand in hand with the fuel transition and the commercialization era is a rebirth of efficiency in a way, as we shift to, as you say, an era where the bottom line is being hit in new ways, and the fuels that are available are likely to be more expensive in the future. So I would expect that the era of efficiency has not ended, and that we'll perhaps see that coming to be something that really gains a lot of focus in the future as well. You landed nicely on a point in respect of risk there, which is a nice segue to come to Andreas, whose role is very orientated around risk. And Andreas, I understand from dialogue that we have separately, you've been very immersed in one particular regulation over the last couple of years, which is, of course, FuelEU. And I think the audience would love to hear your insight as to how does an organization of the size and the complexity of Norden go about responding to regulatory change of the kind of magnitude that FuelEU has introduced?
Absolutely. Yeah, you're absolutely right. In the last 2 to 3 years, I've been working extensively with FuelEU, not exclusively with FuelEU, because there are so many interactions with other pieces of regulations that can benefit from one another or interact with one another. But you are right, and as Dennis brilliantly just captured this evolution. It's also relatively important to say that many of these steps have happened quite rapidly. It's not a 50-year progress that's been going on for a long time. Much of this is right here, right now as well. And that makes it sometimes a bit difficult for, first of all, industries such as shipping, which is not the fastest to react in our traditions, and also to the large organizations. So how we approached it in Norden was to actually break it down into a couple of steps instead, to not get, let's say, overwhelmed, especially in the early stages of, for instance, FuelEU, when knowledge was so scarce, when you had a piece of legislation and no one actually knew how to actually understand it. So that was the very, very first step, really dive into the regulation, interact with the interest organizations and interact with the Commission and really get the understanding of the regulation. And once you have that understanding, you can also start mapping out the risks. As you mentioned yourself, I'm a risk analyst at the very core of what I do. And when we're dealing with FuelEU regulations, you're also dealing extensively with contracts, and then that mapping of risk becomes really, really important. So once you start mapping out the risk, you can start on creating a plan of what you want to do. But in the very essence of it all, the most important part is, in a large organization such as Norden, is the spread of information, the education, making sure that it's not only one person sitting at the center or at the core and trying to push the information out into the organization, but actually making sure that different departments, different people, different roles have the ownership of what this is. Because as Dan was mentioning earlier on, FuelEU is also about commercialization. It's a part of a product that you can sell. It's a part of the product offering that our cargo clients could be interested in. It's some service that we can own, that we can offer to our owners in that case. So a lot of this is also educating the organization, that everyone, and not just some either risk management department or a compliance department or what other department, is aware of what FuelEU or these regulations are, but it's actually part of the broader landscape of the organization. And first, when you come to that step, that understanding throughout the organization, that's when you can start on executing. That's when you can really put in the commercial aspects of it. You can start, when you have mapped all of the risks, you can start creating contracts that are beneficial both to you, your cargo clients, and your owners, and so on. But again, luckily to us, we have a lot of biofuel experience over the past 10 years. So we had a lot of experience that we could draw from in this space. We had a lot of really sharp people working in Norden. I myself, I know next to nothing about these new different fuel types. That's not my specialty, but I'm very lucky to be in an organization where we have those capabilities. And in some way, not all organizations are that lucky. I mean, when first FuelEU for the first long time, and we're still seeing now more than 1 year into the regulation, this was first and foremost a regulation built for people with a portfolio, as Dan was also mentioning before, large companies that can benefit from the interactions between vessels, and not necessarily for the small operator with, let's say, a 5-person overhead, where there is no specific function that could go in and really navigate these new waters. So yeah, I think breaking it down and summing up what I just said, it was all about making sure we had the understanding, the capacities, educating, planning, and executing everything along the way.
Yeah, fantastic. And I really hear what you say around that education element. There are perhaps relatively few people who will have read the EU ETS draft legislation and its different iterations. I was one of them at a time when the notion of maritime emissions being within the EU ETS was really quite wild and not really understood in the industry at all. And that journey of education, information spreading, but then integration of information, which is so critical. I remember in early contract negotiations where we would be trying to put clauses in place that there were aspects of them that were not necessarily prejudicial to the other party. It was about enabling both parties to do what they needed to do so that there could be compliance. There would be real resistance to those because of a lack of understanding perhaps on our counterparty's part. And it's happened more than once in different transactions where we've actually been asked, as one side's lawyers, to present an educational piece to the other side so that the contract negotiations can move forward and the parties aren't kind of in dispute about something that they don't need to be. So that integration of information is really important. I think for small organizations, you hit the nail on the head. People are already stretched, resources are limited. To grasp the breadth and depth of decarbonisation is a great challenge. And then in large organisations to be consistent in terms of integration, to have everyone on the same page in terms of what the priorities are, that's a different kind of challenge. So that's really, I appreciate what you shared with us there, because I think that can be a bit of a roadmap perhaps for those who are thinking about how to respond to regulation as it increasingly lands with the industry. One quick follow-up question in relation to risk. What do you see as the biggest risk? Does that orientate around non-compliance, or is it stranded assets, or is it perhaps financial? I ask because I heard a surprising answer from someone recently, so I'm curious to hear what you might say.
Now I'm curious to hear what you had. But if I take my own perspective first, I think the greatest risk that we see here is the risk of misalignment, that we're not sharing the correct responsibilities, that we're not creating the correct contractual arrangements that make sure that the risk lies the correct place. So in some sense, the largest risk, as I see it, is the risk of not sharing the risk correctly. And what I mean by that is essentially saying that, well, if you're operating a vessel for 11.5 calendar months of a given year, well, then you have the majority of the operational risk for that that compliance year, that reporting year in FuelEU Maritime at least. So I think that it makes sense that risk of generating the compliance, of purchasing the compliance, lies with the person having the operational risk at the same time. So I think that the risk sharing is an extremely important piece that is often overlooked and forgotten, because again, if people don't know exactly how your risk picture lies, if you're an owner and you have chartered out to someone, well, it doesn't say anywhere that charter will generate compliance for you, even if you chartered out for 2 or 3 years. Just says there is some compensation going on potentially, but you are still, as an owner, left in the awful situation of having a non-compliant vessel, even if you're compensated financially for it. And I think that danger is one of the main focus that I'm at least trying to help our stakeholders navigate and educate them about, is that we need to make sure that you as an owner are absolutely certain that your charter will either generate the compliance, or that you as an owner have sufficient amount of time and compensation to generate it yourself.
Interesting. And I think we'll drill into some of those points a little later. The misalignment point really goes to the idea that this is all in an ecosystem and there are many different actors, which of course complicates the response to regulation. That's something that we've seen repeatedly with the industry's response to emissions regulation. The answer that I received when I asked this question to someone recently was they saw that their biggest risk was falling behind what was required by their customers. And I thought that was really interesting. I didn't anticipate that would be their response. But on that note, thinking about customers, as lawyers, we are service providers to the industry, and as fuel suppliers, you sit in a similar position, Gabriela. I'm interested to hear, what is it that you see from your perspective that the industry needs from fuel suppliers now that is different to the pre-FuelEU era, and how is it that Peninsula is meeting that need?
Yeah, thanks, Rachel. I mean, I was listening to Andreas and thinking, that it resonates. The short answer first, I guess, is the way that I see it, the way that we see it, is that customers should really look for a strategic partner, not just a fuel seller anymore. In the pre-FuelEU Maritime era, suppliers were mainly selected, not generalizing, but mainly selected based on just price and availability. So it was chasing a price. Today, customers really need those strategic partners who can navigate the regulation and understand the regulation and can mitigate the cost exposure, and then they can support the alternative fuel decisions and can provide the relevant documentation that stands up to verify scrutiny, including the certifiable emissions data, so that the vessels can calculate the GHG intensity, etc., required under FuelEU Maritime. Fuel suppliers must provide proof of sustainability documentation and emission factors for every alternative fuel supplied. And to do that, suppliers need to be certified with reputable schemes like the ISCC. So really, the old days of a one-man band supplier that had questionable good prices is really not going to cut it anymore. So Peninsula is ISCC certified and is therefore filling that space by integrating all of those aspects, the legal, the regulatory, the commercial, operational, sustainability aspects, and its expertise into the customer support model. And finally, which I think, very important, obviously, FuelEU is driving demand for biofuels, bio-LNG, and other alternative fuels. So Peninsula has been working really hard to scale up its alternative fuels product portfolio, including bio-LNG, biofuels, and is now, as I mentioned earlier, looking into the future, i.e. ammonia and methanol pathways.
Great. I think if I was in the position of wanting to purchase fuel, I would find that very reassuring, especially around the documentation side of things, which is, the requirements that are imposed through FuelEU are essentially quite new, and the risks there in respect of fraud, problems with proof of sustainability documentation. There will be new provisions soon for the retroactive cancellation of proof of sustainability documentation, which would really be a nightmare for entities which are in pooling agreements and perhaps have already sold compliance in respect of batches of fuel that they've purchased. The need to have security in terms of both security of supply and the qualities are crucial. I'd certainly be looking to receive reassurance around that. We've talked quite a bit, though, about the regulation which falls on the shipping industry. Something which is perhaps less apparent sometimes is that as fuel suppliers, Peninsula is also regulated, right? Specifically in this context by the Renewable Energy Directive. So how is it that regulation and the obligations that you have to meet under that regulation, how do they impact the way in which you are able to supply fuel to your customers?
Yeah, thanks. So we're talking about RED III here, and extremely relevant for marine suppliers, and actually, very excited to be talking about that today. That probably tells you, I'm a lawyer if I'm excited to talk about that. But yeah,
I'm glad there are opportunities out there.
Yeah. And the reason why is because obviously I appreciate that, RED might not be in the radar of many of our listeners, because really it affects mainly suppliers directly, but this is going to affect our customers indirectly, if it's not already affecting them, given that obviously, it's already kind of come into effect. So if you guys bear with mine a little bit, I'm going to give you a quick overview, just precisely because maybe it's not that much of that knowledge of the directive. So, just to give you a flavor of it. So RED III introduces for the first time obligations on us as marine fuel suppliers, and it requires a number of things, including registration with national authorities, reporting on all fuel deliveries, and participating on national renewable energy registries. The main purpose of the directive, of course, is to increase the share of the renewable of low carbon energy, including now maritime, which wasn't before. And that is mandating suppliers to document and surrender renewable energy credits or equivalent instruments based on the fuels that we place on the EU market. Member states were expected to transpose the maritime elements of RED in 2025, 2026, early 2026, but implementation has been significantly delayed and very inconsistent across the EU. Why, you may ask? And I think we lost Rachel there. Unlike FuelEU Maritime, which is a regulation, RED is a directive. And that means that each country is free to implement it into national law. Effectively, as long as they meet the ultimate targets, each country can choose how to get there, and hence the inconsistencies that we're seeing. However, the key emerging challenge for us as a supplier that I wanted to highlight today is the misalignment between RED III and FuelEU Maritime. As you know, FuelEU Maritime focuses on the vessel's GHG intensity performance, whilst RED imposes our supplier side renewable energy quotas. So it creates situations where a fuel that counts for FuelEU Maritime compliance for our customers does not qualify on their national RED III transposition, particularly where member states are excluding certain type of fuels like the ones in Annex 9B for biofuels eligibility. So this creates massive commercial confusion, compliance risks, and the potential for ships diverting to ports with more relaxed RED III transposition. As I don't know if you guys have noticed, but seen in the Netherlands since the beginning of the years, where the ongoing mitigation discussions about the fuel price impacts and the huge drop in demand since January this year is really affecting them. So I guess to answer the question, really, just as a recap, the suppliers have been extremely affected by all of this. But it will in turn also affect our customers and how they choose to buy and how they choose to bunker. Because the reality of the situation with that sort of background and context is that certain products that a customer may ask for tick the regulatory box for them, but it doesn't tick the regulatory box for us as a supplier and so far as RED is concerned. Yeah. So there may be additional compliance costs or risks for the purposes of RED.
Yeah. And I think the solution there, I think it's really interesting because I've seen this firsthand where there's been fuels which have been identified by us as a shipping company, or my previous position as a shipping company, where there's a particular feedstock that looks interesting, but when you go to talk to the supplier, actually it's not possible to supply, or it doesn't fit in with the portfolio of products that they're trying to supply because it doesn't give the necessary benefits under RED III that they want. And I guess the question we need to answer is how do you bridge that? How do you align that misalignment? How do you bridge that gap? And I think as is often been the case, I don't know how many times in the last decade I've talked about collaboration between suppliers and buyers, but it's about breaking down those traditional yours and mine barriers and actually looking at, okay, what is it that you require as a consumer of fuels, and what is it that we are able to supply, and what fits in with what we can supply, and you kind of work collaboratively to be able to meet both of your combined needs. So I think that's a really important thing. And I think involved in that is the need for buyers to engage with suppliers early, even if they don't know all of the answers themselves yet. They won't know the answers. It's very important that buyers should engage with their suppliers, and particularly seek out suppliers who are well equipped to deal with this complexity, like Peninsula are.
Absolutely. Thank you, Daniel. Yeah, I mean, that brings me back to the answer to the previous question. I mean, it really is complex, and obviously we don't have all the answers, but we do spend significant amount of time tracking the directive in each of its jurisdictions and all of its variations, and trying to understand, okay, how do we move the pieces to understand that we know the customer's needs and we have our book of customers and we more or less know what are the requirements. And so how do we move the piece so that if we can no longer supply here, we can maybe do it somewhere else, or we can offer something different. And, it's kind of combining that experience and obviously understanding in this case, the directive and how it's been implemented to try to put like a plan that works for both Peninsula and our customers. But it's difficult. And of course, what we also been doing is lobbying and spending a lot of time with with each of the national sort of the governments and government bodies that are kind of working on the implementation. Some of them are a bit more open to feedback than others, but we try. And the inconsistency between the FuelEU and RED has been flagged in numerous occasions, and so we're trying. I think they are aware. Hopefully, even if it's not in the first round, they will fix that, because it just doesn't make any sense and it's not helping anyone. Hi, Rachel. Welcome back.
I'm back. There was a power cut, so everything went off suddenly, but here I am, I'm back in the room. I missed a little bit of the discussion there. Perhaps you might have answered already a question that I had in mind, which was because of the kind of all of the complexities around fuel supply now, and this is really a question for Dan and for Andreas. is there a preference here to move into that? Gabriela's identified it already in a way, the kind of strategic partnerships, the long-term offtake agreements, in preference to more of a spot purchasing approach.
Yeah, I mean, if I could start, maybe I would just say that I understand why, when you go to industry events, you talk to ship owners. The vast majority of ship owners, specifically those, or not even ship owners, ship operators, charterers, companies that operate specifically in the bulk or tanker sector, they see this decarbonisation shift as something which is happening elsewhere in a way. Unfortunately, these regulations are landing on their doorstep, but it's very difficult for them to be able to engage properly. I'm generalising massively here, but I think it's a fair reflection that there are many ship owners and operators out there who go, I don't understand this. I don't have the resources. I don't know what fuels I should be taking, where I should take them. Should I invest in this? Should I invest in that? You're just trying to survive year to year anyway, without thinking about the next 25 years. So there's a couple of things I would say here, just to broadly characterize the industry. And I always have this example in my mind quite a lot when I think about building new ships. When you look at houses that are being built in the country, if I think about the UK, and when we build new houses, when you see a housing estate being built with 2,000 or 4,000 houses on it, how many of those houses have solar panels, have heat pumps, have ground source heating, or any of these other kind of measures to reduce the energy efficiency or improve the energy efficiency of the house itself? How many of them run on alternative fuels, essentially? The answer is very little, actually, because the producer, the building company that just built the company that builds these housing estates, they have one interest: create the most marketable asset, build a house that can be sold to the broadest spectrum of the buyers in the market. That's true of shipbuilders in many sectors. If you look at self-builders of houses, if you were to build a house yourself and you were to fund it yourself, buy a plot of land and build a house, what's the one thing you would absolutely make sure you would do? You would introduce as much alternative technology into it. You would make it as efficient to run for the next 20, 30, 40 years you're going to live in that house as possible. The same is exactly true in the shipping industry. And that's relevant to liner services. It's relevant to cruise ships, to ferries, to ro-ro carriers, to container vessels, because they tend to be owner-operators. They build their own asset to operate them for the life of the vessel, or at least the majority of the life of the vessel. So I can completely understand why the industry gets sort of split into those which are engaged in developing these vessels with very specific requirements in energy efficiency and so on, and those which just say, I need to build a ship and then put it out into the market and see what charterers want. What that then leads into is the same thing happens on fuels, on the purchase of fuels. Purchase of fuels can be sort of broadly categorized, as I think you started here, Rachel, by saying spot versus offtake. Do you go out and buy fuels on a spot basis and just deal month to month or quarter to quarter or year to year? Or do you sign 5, 10-year contracts for certain types of fuels? And one of the reasons for decision paralysis from buyers is that new fuels, specifically alternative fuels, they introduce all kinds of risks. I mean, they introduce certification and traceability risks. They introduce risks around regulatory value. Is this going to be recognized under this regulation or that regulation? Gabriela's already talked about, the misalignment between certain regulations within one jurisdiction in the EU. What availability is of this fuel or of that fuel? So in general, spot markets really struggle with compliance-linked traceability. That's a big issue. And, what I think you will see a trend towards, and already you see it in those sectors I talked about, the liner services, the cruise ships, the ro-ro carriers, and so on. These sectors look for a base offtake to build security. So let's build a portfolio of product which is going to cover a certain amount of our energy demand, and then we'll maintain some spot for flexibility. And then mechanisms like FuelEU pooling then can start to exist for optimization and tweaking of that kind of pool. The shift is already underway. The way that fuels are procured is already evolving into compliance procurement and portfolio management. So I think the message I would have to any attendees who are shipping companies or operators or charterers who are thinking to sit back and wait, let's just see what happens in general in the industry, is you need to be engaging and understanding what different fuels look like and how you can introduce them to your fleet. It's not realistic to expect you to sign a 10-year offtake agreement, but you need to start to make the steps towards securing alternative fuels, or at least understanding the risks associated with alternative fuels.
Sound advice, I think, there. Andreas, any different perspective on that? Norden's fleet is a little different, of course.
Yeah, I actually really like the picture of the building a house yourself, and the person level, I absolutely agree.
It's a great analogy.
I do think that to again play devil's advocate and look at it again from an owner operator perspective, that makes absolutely great sense if you know where you're going to live for the next 5, 10, 20 years. But if you don't know where you're going to be tomorrow, it's very difficult to make sense of making that investment into these energy efficient houses. So taking that back to the shipping industry, yes, I definitely agree. And we're also seeing that is the liner companies, the RoRo, the ferries, the cruises, all of these aspects have a bit of an easier time maybe making the investments into these new fuel types and engines, because it makes sense. They know they're going from A to B and B to A and back and forth, and they can make these more long-term agreements. But if you are in the bulker space, either wet or dry bulk, you are more of a tramp business. You don't know if you're going to call a port where you will have LNG available. You don't know if there's going to be biofuel available. You don't know what there will be available wherever you're going when you don't know where you're going. So that makes it a bit difficult to make these long-term agreements, and that makes the tramping companies makes it a bit at a disadvantage in this space, because as a company such as Norden, we haven't made the decision yet on what we believe is the future fuel. We believe that we should do what we can in the here and now, and that is putting biofuel on board of our vessels. So it means that what we're operating with as a tramp business focusing on biofuel in the here and now, it makes it a bit difficult to make these long-term agreements, because we simply do not know, will we pass through the ARA region, will we pass through Singapore, Gibraltar, whatever, sufficient amount of times at the correct times on the correct itineraries. We prefer to do it on EU-related voyages for EU ETS and FuelEU reasons. So it makes it a bit difficult actually to make these long-term offtake agreements if you do not know or if you have a high volatility in your itineraries, such as we have. We don't have that luxury of predictability, and that is also why I think that a company such as USCC is able to generate, for instance, compliance at a lower cost than, for instance, a tramp company focusing on biofuel would be able to be. Yeah. But and that again comes back to, as we've been talking a few times now, is about the risk. I mean, long-term offtake agreements is a risk-reducing measure, which is unfortunately not available to a company such as Norden at the current amount of time. At the same time, you cannot really hedge your biofuel or your LNG or your e-methanol exposure using the paper markets. So you are a bit left into the hands of the spot market in this sense, when you do not have that predictability in your itineraries. And again, come back to also what I talked a bit about earlier, is then that if you then take Norden as a large company, I mean, we can and we do make long-term offtake agreements on biofuel products. But if you're then a small company where you maybe operate 50 vessels, or a relatively small company with 50 vessels, this becomes more or less important when you're in the tramp business, and more or less impossible when you're in the tramp business. And I think that again is just one of the elements that puts the smaller companies at a disadvantage when we're talking about the FuelEU at least, and EU ETS for that matter.
It's very much a case, and I hear this resonated from lots of different quarters, that the solution and the strategy has to be very specific to the fleet, the operations, the geographies, etc. There is no one-size-fits-all solution, and I think you've illustrated that really very clearly there. Something that I see with all of the kind of change that regulation introduces, including the transition to new fuels, but also the response to regulations in terms of the need to comply, and then the financial components of them, is that it gives the parties a lot to grapple with. And you've alluded to this already, Andreas, in terms of those behavioural changes need to be reflected in contractual changes, because it's ultimately in the contracts where the parties set out what they are going to do differently, how they're going to do it differently, and critically where they deal with the risks and liabilities, and navigating those issues in an ecosystem where there are different contracts that need to be aligned. We've touched on alignment already. That's really difficult work, and these are the types of issues that I'm sure we're all seeing, and certainly for me, they're on my desk every day, and they are unrelentingly complex. They are highly consequential, and I often see that it's breaking new ground in a lot of ways. There are perhaps some template clauses that can be brought to play in particular environments, but they often need to be heavily adapted to fit with the particular factual context. So there's a lot of re-engineering going on the contractual level, as well as in the world of the practical business of fuel supply and engineering of technologies. As a fellow lawyer, Gabriela, I wonder, I'm curious to hear, what types of agreements are you involved in re-engineering at the minute to enable these decarbonisation behaviours, and what are some of the main considerations for you?
Yeah, I mean, quite right. There's growing contractual complexity in bunker contracts and all other related type of contracts, but really what used to be a relatively simple bunker contract, so your product and this is the price, and there were the usual issues about claims and quality, etc., but relatively simple, are now really complex, multi-layered agreements, and potentially include, so many different things. Obviously, things that we talked about, that the FuelEU Maritime compliance clauses, things like the sustainability certifications, the GHG intensity and life cycle emission clauses, the emissions reductions clauses, RED compliance clauses, and it just becomes really complicated contract to present to a customer. And something that I think we need to be very careful with is what we're talking about, which is these template clauses, because by not understanding all of these very complicated issues, people just copy paste the template clauses that think are going to actually apply to them, or they want it, or they demand it, and want this in here without actually understanding what it means. And inadvertently, you actually bring yourself in potential risk of taking more liability that you should have, and it's just simply not understanding something. Or sometimes, like the recent example that we now have, which is becoming really popular, is emissions reductions, which is another type of contract that we deal with. This is to do with the carbon inset, the voluntary market, right? So we have those separate type of agreements, but it's linked to our physical supply sales of biofuels. And so there's a lot of clauses around that. How do you carve it out? Who keeps the emissions, the credits, i.e. scope 3, do you keep them? Do you take them? And people don't understand that. And so it's very complex. So it's not only having to spend the time to actually draft it. There's a lot of education piece, not only to our customers, but even to the company, our traders, our commercial teams. Work really closely with our decarbonisation team. And so they spent a lot of time talking to the various teams and trying to kind of this education piece to kind of deal with that complexity. So as a legal function, we really spend a lot of time integrating this regulatory language into the contracts these days, for sure.
Yeah, and I really hear the passion of a fellow lawyer there for the delicacy of the work. And as you say, the challenge in understanding and having to flip these concepts through lots of different factual scenarios that could arise in the course of a charter party, say, where you might have a vessel that produces compliance or produces deficit. There's all kinds of different situations to try and account for. And it certainly, in my experience, I receive clauses that land on my desk and I'm advising clients on, and something that perhaps counterpart charterers, for instance, might have drafted as their version of the clause is not actually advantageous to them. And again, it's coming back to that education piece of walking through what the different parameters are, what the concepts are, trying to apply them in different factual scenarios. And I agree, there's really a huge amount going on there. Andreas, I know that you've been doing quite a lot around contractual adaptation as well, specifically again in the FuelEU context. Where are your priorities at the moment, and where do some of the main challenges lay for you?
Well, the main challenge
you also have the passion.
But I mean, the main challenge that we have to do with more or less every single charter party that we agree into is actually speaking to what I said earlier, the education part. When we're talking FuelEU Maritime, at least, we're seeing that we have so many stakeholders out there on both sides of the charter party chain who do not know enough about FuelEU to enter into contractual arrangements yet. So first starting point is really to say, okay, this is the regulation, this is what we can do, this is what perhaps we think we should do, and then trying to say that, okay, but what's in it for you? And to me, at least, unfortunately, we have a BIMCO clause, which is really the default in many parts of the regulation. The clause work that we're doing on FuelEU Maritime, which was a really great starting point once the regulation was about to come into place, but in this day and age does not really add up with the reality of FuelEU Maritime and how it actually works. So I think one of the largest difficulties or challenges that I have is that, okay, I not only do I have to help owners actually understand what FuelEU Maritime is, still here more than 1 year after, but also tell them that, okay, yes, that's correct, but actually when we're looking at the BIMCO clause, it's not a great idea to just take that unamended. We have to revise it, have to fit it such that it fits our relationship. There are some pieces in there in the BIMCO clause which are disadvantage to the owner. There's some places which are in there which is a disadvantage to the operator. So it's a really understanding of making both sides of the party understand what is in it for them and how we can improve that, because shipping is inherently relational, and having and really taking that lens on when talking about the clauses in terms of FuelEU Maritime can benefit both. And I think one of the really central things that we're seeing and that I'm spending a lot of time talking about is saying that pricing of FuelEU compliance at the penalty rate is not a sustainable way to price it. The more information there is in the market, the more every single actor knows about FuelEU Maritime, then it also becomes clear that the market has abundance of compliance. It just has to be spread correctly. And once that is realized for the parties involved, there's also saying that we're not willing to pay the penalty price if the actual cost of compliance is 1/3 or 25% of that penalty price. And having these conversations, creating this understanding is difficult. Of course, it is about money, so it always will be difficult. But when we're going 5 years or 10 years down the road, I think it's clear to everyone to say that the level of penalties is non-sustainable, especially in face of a much, much lower cost of actual compliance. So I think having these kind of conversations is difficult, but necessary as well.
Yeah, and what you say there really resonates with me. I'm drafting a lot of pricing provisions essentially at the moment, and they may be orientated towards different indices, but there's a real shift from a penalty-based approach to an abatement-based approach. And I never see anyone trying to, well, maybe this is because they don't land on my desk, but I never see anyone trying to insert an unamended BIMCO clause. I agree with you. I think that's been a helpful starting point in terms of getting some consensus around particular concepts and illuminating some of the key issues. But we see that the clauses usually go to much greater depth and detail. I mean, I had one on my desk recently, which was 8 pages long, which personally maybe a little too long, I would say. But the sort of different approaches from different players in the industry as to how they want to price compliance surplus, where they want to have pooling rights. There's so much of the negotiation actually orientates around that. The compliance piece is by far the more minor part, and the major part of the discussion is around the pooling and the pricing.
Absolutely, I couldn't agree more. No.
Yeah. If we named FuelEU, FuelEU.
Yeah, exactly. It's so true. Most of the time is spent on the pricing element and the pooling element, absolutely. And if I can just make one big suggestion to all owners out there is that make sure that you change the wording from a pooling right to a pooling obligation. You should not be placed in a situation where you have 7 days to secure compliance if your charter does not with the pooling rights. It has to be a pooling obligation. I mean, again, as I said before, we are an owner operator. We are on both sides of the dealings. We cannot have that uncertainty, that risk that our charter does not generate the compliance. If they have pooling rights, they must exercise them, and therefore an obligation. Just throwing that in the bucket as a free piece of advice.
Interesting, very interesting. I mean, you brought us neatly there to pooling, and I think this chimes with a question that someone raised in the chat as well, around that. We can kind of pivot here from thinking about challenges to thinking about opportunities. And I mean, FuelEU, it's stuck. FuelEU undoubtedly brings into play this massive commercial opportunity, which just wasn't there previously, which is the opportunity on a regulatory basis to monetize over compliance. Back in the contractual realm, of course, there's a regulatory dimension to pooling, but really, it's a private contractual arrangement, the sale and purchase of compliance, which then gets plugged into the regulatory realm. What we see when we're looking at the contracts, because of course we're reviewing those and advising on those, is again a huge amount of variety, creativity, a real variety in terms of the quality of the drafting, the quality of the concepts. I know you've been in that space as well, Andreas. Perhaps you're able to give us some insight. What have your experiences in that realm been like thus far?
Absolutely. I mean, FuelEU creates a lot of commercial opportunities, and I'm sure Dan can also elaborate on how they have been doing it there. But at the very essence, for Norden at least, we see FuelEU as a service. And when I say FuelEU as a service, it's mainly on the pooling side of things. That means that, again, as a relatively large player in this dry and wet bulk industry, we can either help some of our stakeholders, some of our commercial partners, or some of our owners in making sure that they actually have a compliant vessel without having to lift a finger. We try to be a name that people can trust, and I hope we succeed in doing that. And if we tell, or if we offer a close owner or a close pool partner of ours, sorry, if we have a commercial tanker pool, that's why I say pool partner, that they can join our regulatory pool as well for FuelEU Maritime, our compliance pool, then they will have a incentive to join. They want to be part of the Norden name, Norden brand, hopefully, and also therefore we hope, of course, to make closer business relationships with those partners as well. And the other part is, and I actually think that ties really greatly into one of the questions that I saw in the chat from Anne-Marie Bjergård about the BIMCO clause, because what we have seen is that some owners actually trying to create what she calls penalty profit. That is, of course, when you charter a vessel out, that you take the penalty rate, and then on the inside that you can generate the compliance that's much lower. I mean, I think that's a very rational decision that any owner would try to do. And essentially, it comes back to that the need for information, because that is not a sustainable profit that you can generate in the long term. This is a profit that you might be able to generate in 25, maybe some of 26, but going into 27, 28, as people become more and more aware, and therefore also revise the clauses that they have in the charter party. And again, in Norden, we have a large library of clauses that we apply to any given situation. And of course, in that library, we don't have the penalty rate written anywhere, because we are not willing to pay that when we know the owner is not paying it. Then, of course, you can be pushed into some situations. But that's not to say that we, at least, and now again you say about the commerciality, that we have also, of course, demanded the penalty rate when we have done time charter out, because again, we are in the start of the cycle of FuelEU understanding, but also where we have not covered our back end. We still have our risk. We're not certain about going into 25. We're not certain about what would happen. So I think that part is as a commercial avenue that's going to die out. It's going to dry out relatively quickly, and it more comes into either a service that you can provide for your close relationships to make sure that they are compliant, or it is, maybe as Dan can elaborate about more a bit on this, also a way to productize, or whatever it's called, sustainable fuels offer it as a product to your potential customers.
Yeah, and I think I can see. I think Dan, probably I'll invite you to contribute some more on that. On both sides of the fence, there's the regulatory pooling, but then, as Andreas has touched on, there is also opportunity beyond the scope of regulation. Of course, at the moment we have regulation which geographically has geographical limitations. So two questions to you really, Dan. One is any further comments that you'd like to add on pooling? And then the second is looking beyond the commercial opportunities afforded by regulatory measures. How else can organisations convert decarbonisation behaviours into commercial advantages?
Yeah, so first of all, I mean, a lot of what Andreas said resonates with me. We obviously have been in a position as we, Soya Group, but also the group companies, Wallenius Sol, which has LNG dual fuel Ro-Ro vessels, UECC, which is obviously a fleet which I was working with, which has Ro-Ro vessels. We've been in the fortunate position of having the technology to be introduce biomethane to the vessels, which of course has been a fantastic generator of surplus. And you will see, if you go on LinkedIn, all of those suppliers of biomethane have become pool operators now, basically, because they're capitalizing on that position that it finds itself in. There's a couple of things I would touch on there. So, you know, there's often the question about, you know, have these regulations created commercial opportunities yet? When will that happen? That's already here. Like that's where that ship's already sailed. You know, the commercial opportunities already exist, and anybody who's engaged as a buyer in a pool will understand that. I think FuelEU Maritime, the penalties of FuelEU Maritime, and I've said this quite a lot, if you pay the penalty of FuelEU Maritime, something has gone very wrong internally in your compliance department, because the compliance penalties of FuelEU Maritime are set to be so high as a massive disincentive to go for alternative fuel or to enter a pooling agreement. You know, a fine of €600+ per ton of CO2 is completely absurd in the context of what the cost of CO2 per ton is when you use almost any alternative fuel. So you then face the internal question of, well, what should we have done? You know, okay, it can be the case that biomethane doesn't work for you because of all of the reasons that Andreas articulated very well. You don't have the technology for it, or you don't have the forecastability of where your vessels will be, and so on. So what happens is then you look to other alternative fuels. So where we're at now is, as a shipping company such as UECC, which operates and owns vessels, there's chartered vessels and there's owned vessels, understanding the complexity of the regulation, understanding the complexity of regulation will reward you in the long run. So it kind of all starts with an internal education, building what we should call it regulatory literacy. You know, building regulatory literacy within your organization will give you a huge advantage. Surplus generation and banking strategies, the clearest obvious opportunity that has come out of this regulation. I think in terms of what this regulation does, regulation introduces friction. When you understand the system, you get to convert that friction into value for your organization. And I think if we look at the message that I want to get across to those who maybe not engaged in alternative fuels yet, is that there are pathways. You don't have to consider that going into alternative fuels is something that somebody else does, and you have to buy compliance surplus from somebody else. There are opportunities to do this. What you might struggle with understanding how to capitalize on the value of that alternative fuel in the first place through FuelEU pooling, for example. My personal view on this is that the next breakthrough that happens in the maritime industry is not necessarily going to be a molecule, but potentially a data platform. You know, it's going to be a platform through which those who invest in alternative fuels can realize the value of the alternative fuel. And that comes to the question that you asked me there, Rachel, about how do shipping companies commoditize or commercialize the value of alternative fuels. Clearly, FuelEU is one of them, but it's not the only way you can commercialize alternative fuels. The emissions reduction potential of alternative fuels is a commercial value that you need to understand when you introduce it to your fleets. And then you need to understand the mechanisms required to recover that. And in the case of UECC, again, we had, before FuelEU Maritime, we had a Scope 3 program. We had voluntary carbon emission reduction program, which was being sold to car manufacturers and also to other cargo owners. So even if your own cargo owners aren't interested in alternative fuels or emission reductions, other maritime users are, and they would be potentially interested. So there's quite a lot of avenues to explore in how you realize the value in alternative fuel.
Yeah, well, I think that's a great pitch for anyone who is on the fence about whether alternative fuel is something to start exploring in this era, or whether it's something that they're perhaps mentally posting into the future. We've covered a lot there, and I see that there's quite a few questions coming up in the chat, so it would perhaps be nice to pick up a few of those. I'll come first, sticking with fuel, because that's what we're on at the moment, to a question asked by Duncan Wise. It's addressed initially to Andreas, and Duncan's question is, what's the biggest bottleneck when implementing biofuel strategy in your chartered in fleet? Do you meet many objections from owners and or technical restrictions? How easy has it been to manage? Theory into operational outcome in that regard? And your thoughts on the best way to integrate specific charter party clauses into backward-looking regulatory reconciliation efforts and forward-looking planning to lower OPEX. So quite a lot there, but I believe in your capacity to unpackage that.
I'll try my best. Yeah, I mean, I want to say the obvious, but the very, very much biggest bottleneck is, let me start over. I'll actually I can split it into two parts. I'll say before 2025 and after 2025. The biggest bottleneck is the same, but it's just a tremendous change has been happening as we went into 2025 and FuelEU came to place. And that's, of course, getting owners to accept that we use biofuel. We have, again, in Norden for, I think, around 8 years been burning biofuel, starting off on our own vessels and then slowly trying to spread the word, if so to say. And what we've seen is that it has been a very, very difficult job. It's been extremely difficult to convince owners to burn the biofuel, even if we had engine manufacturers saying that everything was okay, even if all of our test results showed that everything was okay. It has been very, very difficult. But now with FuelEU coming into place in January 2025, I've seen a tremendous increase in the biofuel clauses that we've been doing with owners, the amount of owners that are now okay in accepting or at least seriously considering biofuel on their vessels. So that has really made a huge change in that respect. And I think just having that greater flexibility, we were talking about it recently. I was a bit complaining to Dan about me as a tramp operator, having a bit less predictability in my itineraries. The more of my fleet that have biofuel rights, the less important is this predictability, because that means that I can pick and choose whichever of our 500 vessels, and I'm pretty certain that one of those will be fine for FuelEU compliance. And so that's the absolutely largest bottleneck that we have been implementing. And then that actually is also then the second largest one that I just mentioned is, again, back to us as a tramp operator. We have a difficulty in getting long-term offtake agreements that make sense, again, because we want to use our biofuel for FuelEU purposes. The other part of our biofuel, which we use for voluntary markets, is a bit easier because then there is not the same requirement for EU-related voyages. That means that we can have a bit more of these offtake agreements. But at least when we're talking in the regulatory landscape, as we are today, this is where the second largest bottleneck. So the largest bottleneck is just getting biofuel on the vessel in the first place. And then secondly, again, we, as a tramp operator, we do not have that predictability.
If I could follow on that, Rachel, I would just say, just speak, and I know you're having a coughing fit as well, so I'll give you the opportunity to take a glass of water. Yeah, I would just add to that. You know, I've been in a position of being the responsible fuel procurement for a company which wants to introduce as much alternative fuel as possible. Now, luckily, much of that fleet was owned by the company itself, so we have our own in-house ship management and technical department. Now, anybody who's ever met a marine engineer engineer will know, you never get a simple yes as soon as you ask a question. There's always a lot more hurdles you have to go over. Our ship management department in UECC were fantastic at kind of taking on the challenges, and the chief engineers, I have to say as well, at taking on the challenges of the fuels that we were putting in front of them and saying, look, here's a fuel, can we try it? I mean, CNSL is probably the if you call the most dramatic of those, because it's a fuel which is quite maligned in the shipping industry in general as something which is scary and damaging. So we introduced lots of different types of fuels to the table and asked our own in-house technical teams to say, can you approve this? Will you use it? And we did. But a good part of the UECC fleet is chartered in. It's chartered in from third-party owners or from even our own owners, but they have completely different technical departments and we have different challenges to overcome. And of course, what helps over the last 6 years that they've been using alternative fuels is, one, experience. Of course, if you can share experience of what's happened on your own tonnage, then of course the other owners are likely to listen to and understand that and say, well, these guys have done some sort of due diligence and they've risked their own assets with this fuel in the first place. The other thing is that with time comes greater standardization. We now see that FAME as a biofuel is now so widely accepted and standards are existing for it in the marine fuel context, which make it much more accessible and available to companies who previously maybe were a bit put off by that. So I think that's a really important shift. But again, it's engagement with the owners of the vessels that you charter, and kind of saying, this is a fuel. I mean, if you want to start with lab tests and take it to shore engine tests, we're happy to do that. And then we start a phased rollout on board of vessels. That's how you actually start to implement these fuels. It's not realistic to pick something which is a bit of an avant-garde fuel and say, can we just throw it on board the ship and start using it? So I think that, there's definitely an approach here that should be taken by charterers.
I think that's, excuse me, great guidance. And it's interesting, I mean, it comes back to the point Andreas made about shipping being relational. It's about having a dialogue with your counterparty and, as you say, Dan, taking those small steps initially. Excuse me. With, as well as the power, it's also my voice that's going today. We have a couple more questions that are fuel-centric in the chat, so I'll maybe deal with those and then perhaps we'll move on. Gabriela, perhaps you'd be able to respond on these ones. One is in relation to RFMBO certificates. And the question is, do you see RFMBO certificates as an issue to get profit? You would say that the green fuel you are using is in fact green. I mean, the certification issue is really at the heart of the alternative fuel purpose. Really?
I mean, absolutely. And we touched on this earlier, right? I mean, this is why having the right supplier where you're sourcing the product, whatever the alternative fuel is, whatever the product is, that is duly certified. You go through like a very intense auditing process, and the traceability of it is a key element. So for sure, I mean, that's why you need a reliable partner. That's why you need a reliable supplier where you can see, okay, you know, where are you sourcing this from? Show me your proof of sustainability, show me the traceability, mass balances, whatever it may be, to make sure that what you're purchasing is green for the purposes that you need it to be it the voluntary or be it the regulatory, because and I think this is where, ironically, with all of the regulation that we have, a lot of these things on the voluntary market are not regulated. So you have to be very careful when you're talking about the voluntary market and, you know, kind of monetizing, etc. You have to be very careful where you're buying those to make sure that there's no the so-called double counting, or that the product that you're buying, or that the certificates that you're buying, the emissions that you're buying are not that are in fact additional, i.e. voluntary, right? So that they're not already kind of being used on the mandatory side. So I mean, I think if the person getting the certificates doesn't have any experience, for sure, you know, you're not going to just buy it from, coming back to my one-man band analogy, you need someone that can show you that certification, a valid certification, be it ISCC, for example, is what I know, because that's what Peninsula uses. There are others, but yeah, I mean, it's so important, and that's how you track it and you make sure that it's green.
Yeah, I think it's fair to say the fuel, whatever its provenance may be, even if it's of the highest caliber, if it's not certified, that's not recognized. So the certification is really key.
It's not going to be counted for sure.
Yeah, and you raise a really important point there as well about the interaction between the kind of voluntary, the commercial opportunities in the voluntary market and the intersection with regulation. We're doing a very detailed piece of work at the moment, demarcating those two markets and looking at the boundaries of those two different realms, precisely to ensure that, as you say, there is no double counting, that it's very clear which fuel gets counted into which space, so that no one is in a position where they are going out and effectively selling the same thing twice. So an important risk to flag in respect of those voluntary commercialization opportunities. We've one last question in the fuel space before I think we sort of move on from fuel as a topic, and I'll open it to everyone. Anyone who wants to comment. There's a question, would like to know the panel's views on ethanol.
Do you want me to go first? I mean, Andreas did open by saying he's not a fuel expert, so I'm gonna,
Go for it.
I'm not going to throw him under the bus there. And I have to.
Responses are not obligatory.
Yeah, exactly. That's right. I have to also confess I'm not an ethanol expert at all. I am, however, looking at some ethanol projects, where it's used obviously as a base to produce other, for other fuels. The problem I see a little bit with ethanol, a lot like you see with green electricity when it comes to e-fuels, is are there other markets which will otherwise pay a higher premium for the fuel that can come out of that feedstock, if you call it that? So it's the same with e-fuels. If you have renewable energy, where else can that renewable energy be used? And is the willingness to pay higher in those other sectors than it is in the maritime? Now, history tells us that maritime generally uses whatever the cheapest fuel available is, and that's no slight on the maritime industry at all. That's pragmatism, I guess you could call it. So it's the same with e-fuels. It's the same with ethanol as well. If ethanol can be used to produce SAF, for example, in the aviation sector, is there a greater willingness to pay for ethanol-based SAF than there is in aviation, than there is in the maritime sector? And do the quality differences exist sufficiently that it makes more sense in one industry than another? It's interesting to explore, but I don't see, compared to the other basket of fuels that are available, I think there are other avenues that the shipping industry will prioritize.
Okay, super. Gabriela, any perspective you want to add on that?
I have zero knowledge on the subject, I'm not going to lie. So
we can probably conclude ethanol's a bit of an outlier in the marine fuel transition world. But thank you for the question. I've got one here that I'll move on to, which resonates a little bit with a question of my own that I wanted to ask, which is, so the question from the audience, and I'm going to merge it with my own question, is, do you see data-driven measures like voyage optimization, energy efficiency, performance monitoring? How far can they take us before having to move to large-scale adoption of alternative fuels? And I'll combine that with my question, which is, apart from fuel transition, what innovations or technologies are emerging that you think will be really meaningful in helping the industry? Open to anyone, whoever would like to go first. Maybe Andreas, I'll come to you.
Yeah, I can jump at that one. So of course, energy efficiency is a great step. It's a very important step. It's the first step that you can take at all. But again, it's not enough. It's a great starting point. It's a great building block, but nothing more than that in the very end. And especially when you take something as a regulation, when you look at the two major emissions regulations, EU ETS and FuelEU. Voyage optimization or efficiency measures will not have any impact whatsoever on your FuelEU compliance. It will help on your absolute penalty or under compliance, so to say, but it will not help that whether you're compliant or not. And again, for the EU ETS, it will help you reduce your EU ETS costs, but it will not help you remove them. So in that way, it actually goes a little way on that part. But of course, it's a great starting point, and it can help reduce your costs. But when it comes back to it, the return on investment is great. It's a low risk. It's great to do the fuel efficiency. But you really have to, in order to benefit from being, let's say, a greener company, then you need to move up the scale, up the ladder, and take something of the more heavy hitting stuff. Yeah. And that said, when many people have talked about, will we see like an influx of efficient vessels going to Europe and inefficient vessels going other places? At least in the wet and the dry bulk segment, that has not been the case whatsoever yet. It's interesting to see now that people realize that EU ETS has been 100% phased in, if there's going to be, and now they actually start seeing these bills on their voyage P&Ls, and those are massive. Interesting to see if there's going to come any movement in that regards, but so far at least we haven't seen any efficiency decision making in the trade flows yet.
And actually, I think what happens is it becomes a bit of there's a cycle here, which is, what's one thing that all alternative fuels are? They're expensive. They're more expensive than conventional fuels. So you have naturally quite a big incentive to not only use alternative fuels, but if you're using alternative fuels, there's also an incentive to use less of them. So you want efficiency on vessels, but I think they're complementary. I mean, they're two complementary things, right? And I think that, like I mentioned at the top of this, like EXI and CII, you get efficiency measures, or theoretically they are efficiency measures, even if they're not, drafted that well. You get efficiency measures that are out there. Then you get market-based measures, cap and trade systems, which drive the actual fuel switching. The real lever on decarbonisation here is an economic one, not a technical one. But it doesn't mean that there aren't benefits through those technical efficiencies and stuff, because obviously you're using expensive fuels.
Yeah. Gabriela, is that anything you want to comment on, or we can move on?
I mean, not really, I suppose, only with
the supply cap on. It's not really your realm, is it?
No, but the only thing I guess to add to that is that, and the obvious point that from us as a supplier, the more demand that there is, the easier it is for us as a supplier to invest in those products and eventually drive the price down. So, it really, it's teamwork here.
Yeah. Okay. Just zooming out a bit, there's a question that's been asked which casts the net a bit wider, and we haven't really talked much about the role of governments, the kind of wider landscape in terms of the sort of pillars that are critical in supporting the marine industry. But there's a question around what should the role of governments, insurers and reinsurers be in supporting the transition towards cleaner operations? I feel we could be lifting the lid on Pandora's box here on the regulation.
I could go. I'll go with my. I'm not.
Regulation.
I'm not well connected politically, and I'm not involved in those machinations. But what I will say is that, like you see in the EU, the government creates the framework. I mean, governments can create a framework. What does that look like, or what does a shipping company want from a government? They want stable, long-term regulatory signals. That's what you want. You want to understand what landscape I'm going to be working within for the next however many years. It means that you're de-risked from being an early mover, investing in alternative fuels. Governments, I said, this can be individual, it can be blocks, it can also be kind of regulatory bodies as well. They can help lubricate the introduction of alternative fuels. You can harmonize certification, clear standards for enforcement. This is a big thing, we've seen this in the past where when we had a sulfur cap, do all member states across the IMO enforce that limit accordingly? Does it still happen now? Insurers and reinsurers, definitely outside of my comfort zone. I can only speak to my experience of introducing, let's call them novel biofuels, non-standard biofuels. Engagement with insurers to say this is a fuel we're looking to introduce, and can insurers be less blunt in the way that they price risk? Can they price the risk of using alternative fuels more intelligently? A ship owner who's trying to bring a new alternative fuel to their vessel for a particular reason, potentially a commercial reason here, as we've explored. Can the insurer price that risk more intelligently rather than just giving a blanket, your vessel is uninsured if you introduce this fuel to it?
Yeah,
I just really I absolutely agree, especially on the latter point, Dan. But I think that's also a bit of a dreamlike scenario to hope that the insurance companies will change in that one. But I do think that you're right in saying that the predictability, the stability is something that's the most important task that the governments can do. I mean, a vessel easily has 25 years of lifetime. And that means that making an investment into a particular kind of fuel it needs to have an investment horizon of that duration. And that really requires stability. And I actually think that also is one of my, not main, but one of the issues, one issue out of many I have with the FuelEU regulation is that this sundown clause in the very end that says that if the IMO actually introduces something of similar nature, then that means that we can repeal either the entirety or some of the FuelEU regulation or to whatever degree. And the reason why I don't like that, because obviously I like the idea of a uniform regulatory framework across the entire 7 oceans. But the idea that you make investments, for instance, if you bind capital into creating banking your surplus into future years, that effectively means that that horizon, that banking horizon, that pooling horizon only goes into maybe 3 or 4 years out into the future. There's still a long way, of course, to go. But again, if you don't have certainty that you generate sufficient compliance and that can be used in the future, you are then left with either selling it now maybe at a discount because you don't want to have bounded capital, or you have that risk that maybe it will be worth nothing in a couple of years. So I think that stability and that investment horizon is so important for the regulators to actually create.
Yeah, and you raise a really important point there that we've not really dived into, but even though we have regulations, those regulations themselves are in flux. You know, CII under major review, FuelEU in many ways not quite finished, RED 3, a lot of change there, EU ETS has provisions in it which mean it could change in the future. It's a very difficult landscape in which to make predictions, in which to make decisions which will have long-term consequences, when, as you say, the horizon might be 3 or 4 years or possibly closer. It's a difficult time for sure, and bringing it to back to the paperwork, which is where I spend time grappling with those issues, drafting for that is really challenging. You know, how do you draft for global legislation which may or may not come into force in the lifetime of the contract? You know, these are difficult issues to deal with, and that flux resonates on many different spheres. It would be a shame if it meant that entities did not feel comfortable to take action, to take first steps. But you know, perhaps as Dan's alluded to, there are first steps that could be taken relatively safely within a framework that's in flux. We're drawing towards the end of our time, but I've got one last question that I would like to ask, which is, I'll ask it of everyone, and if you could keep your answer to just a minute, that would be appreciated.
Try.
I know we could chat all day, but I'm mindful that there may be entities who haven't traded in the EU in the last few years. So in a way, EU ETS, FuelEU, it's all in the future for them. You know, it will only impact them when they first come to trade in the EU. What's one piece of advice you would give to someone in that position to put them on the front foot coming into this regulatory realm?
Shall I go
like to go first? You can, Gabriela.
my answer, I think, is it's very short, because I think we kind of already answered that question throughout the whole session, but I think really it can be summarized into one: you need to understand the regulations, and you need to get your emissions data and documentation in place. So you need to have that. And two, I think you need to work with reputable, sophisticated stakeholders, not only suppliers, but just generally in your supply chain. You need to have that. Especially if you're a newcomer or you're coming back after a couple of years. So a good supplier, reputable supplier or stakeholder, whoever it may be, will be able to help you and explain the different fuels, how they affect your exposure, provide you with sustainability information, certification, documentation, and so that when you do enter that market, then you're not sort of just playing catch up, but you're just already aligned with the expectations.
Yeah. Fantastic. Anything to add on that, Andreas?
It really is the same, just in different words. Again, shipping is a relationship-based industry, and these large emissions regulations, they are easier for the larger companies that have a lot of OAs, a lot of specialist roles to understand and engage with. So I will encourage anyone who hasn't been dealing with EU regulations for a long time, or maybe relatively small and therefore do not have the capacity, ask the larger players, ask your owners or your charters. There is great willingness to help each other. Absolutely. So use that relationship. That's all what shipping is about.
Yeah, I would just add, I would say that the direction of travel for decarbonisation is locked in. Political noise is normal. When you hear these rumblings about this being repealed or that being repealed, this is normal stuff. The structural direction remains intact. There is one direction that we're going in here, and we can sort of all reasonably stay without too much risk, saying that more regulation is coming than less regulation. So plan on continuity. Don't plan on reversals, I would say. And then finally, I think, as I mentioned earlier, build your own internal regulatory literacy. If that involves reaching out to other groups, even Soya Group, even myself, as you can tell, I'm always happy to talk decarbonisation with anybody interested in this. Map the regulatory exposure as early as you can, and understand as well that fuel markets will price the regulation before the enforcement actually reaches the people it's affecting. So what does that mean? That means educate yourselves, move already. If you can secure fuel optionality before it becomes scarce, fantastic. That's really the best position to be in. But it's about engagement and discussion with others in the shipping sector, definitely.
Thank you. Well, thank you, Dan. Thank you, Gabriela. Thank you, Andreas. It's been a really interesting journey through the decarbonisation territory today, and for the audience, I think there have been some fantastic a lot of takeaways and insights that I hope you can reflect on to inform your own perspective and that of your organisations. If you ask questions and we didn't have a chance to answer them, then I'm sure the panellists perhaps won't mind if you want to reach out to them directly. By all means, reach out to me. Feel free to get in touch. It just falls to me, I think, to say thank you, everyone, for your time. BS Group, thank you very much for hosting, and have a lovely rest of day, rest of week, rest of February. See you next time.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.